Hello again. This is JLL with Gnostic Intel on the Internet. It's the 10th of March 2017. This is Talk 10 in the series of Mandela Effect Decoded. And I'm here to tell you that the naming of the Mandela Effect is not by chance. That is, first of all, an assertion I make, an assertion I propose to you, and I intend to back that up and show you how and why it cannot be by chance. And then it's for you to decide, following your own line of reasoning, if you agree with me or not. Now, in this first talk about the naming of the Mandela Effect, in which I'm concentrating directly on that issue, that factor, I will cover 5 points as quickly as I can. Number 1. When I launched this channel, I proposed the PSYQ test. You can spell it PSIQ or PSYQ. And I defined the PSYQ test as an opportunity for you to determine your susceptibility to being psyoped or duped or deceived or tricked by a mind control program. By contrast to your IQ, the intelligence quotient, your PSYQ shows how you use your intelligence, your savvy, in order to detect how someone might be tricking you, how someone might be feeding you a false narrative. And if you follow the results of that report, or if you follow my report on the PSYQ test, which I gave in a previous upload, or if you just look at the comments on the first upload in this channel, you'll see that there is a distinct division of opinions regarding the life story of Nelson Mandela. About 90% of the entries go into the category of majority report, as I called it, as I named it, meaning the majority of people hold this view of who Nelson Mandela was, what he achieved in his life, and how he came to be viewed by the world. And as you'll see if you read through those comments in the comment section, they're remarkably uniform. You could almost say that the people, those of you out there who entered those comments, are kind of reading from the same script. Now let me make a disclaimer here. I don't mean to judge anybody. I'm not putting any of you on the line. I'm not a schoolmaster who's rating you or scoring you on your behavior. It's an exercise in self-awareness, and you can take it or leave it as you like. Let's face it, we live in a world today that is run on psyops, run on fake news, on false narratives and lies. And not every individual has the time to go and research and investigate if a particular narrative is true or not. So I'm using this one particular instance, which is not a universal instance, but in a way, as you'll see, this one particular instance of a narrative does have a universal or generic application to the problem of mind control. This is what I intend to elucidate for you in the current talk and in the immediate talks to come. What I called the minority report, borrowing that term from the film based on a Philip K. Dick story, was the 10% of you, the 10% of entries, who reported, recounted quite a different narrative of the life of Nelson Mandela. Quite a different story than was reported by those in the majority. For instance, I'll read this one instance from the comments section. Nelson Mandela became the leader of South Africa after the fall of apartheid. Mandela was thought to be a trained communist radical, handled by Marxist Jews. He opened the door to today's white genocide against the Boers, but the world memorializes Nelson Mandela as a fair and great leader. So you see, there's a kind of a mix of the majority and the minority views in that opinion. The entry repeats some of the majority opinion, the opinion held by the world at large, but it also asserts other factors about the life of Nelson Mandela. I'll read one more from the minority report in the comment section. Here goes. Nelson Mandela spent most of his life in prison due to acts of terrorism he committed. Mandela was a racist and a communist. His fame currently is upheld by the Jewish-owned media, as he was one of their many puppets used in the destruction of the white man's South Africa. End quote. So you can see that the minority views are quite brutal and that they differ radically from the glowing portrait of Nelson Mandela that you find in the majority views. So what are we to make of this contrast? Which version is true? Do you wonder which version is true? Well, wouldn't that be naturally the question that would come up in anyone's mind? Sitting back, taking an overview of these entries, and wishing to arrive at some conclusion. Well, of course it would. Just think about this for a moment. One of the factors in the narrative about Nelson Mandela that is endlessly repeated in the majority report goes like this. He was a champion of civil rights. He was a fighter, a freedom fighter, using peaceful means to overcome apartheid, which simply was the segregation of white and black people in Africa. And he was unjustly and cruelly imprisoned for many years before a worldwide protest had him released, and then he went on to become the president of his country, the first black president of South Africa, leader of the ANC, and he became a model and a champion and a hero of civil rights and freedom across the entire world, and he received the Nobel Prize. Well, that is a fact. He did receive the Nobel Prize. But how much did I say preceding that statement is factual? Did he pursue the overthrow of apartheid by peaceful means? Did he, in fact, suffer cruelly and unjustly in prison? Well, how would you know unless you went to find out and to investigate the facts using the tool of the internet? Now, needless to say, there's a lot of disinformation on the internet, and you have to know how to use it correctly. There's a lot of disinfo, a lot of misinfo, but the facts are there if you search for them. The real question regarding the life story of Nelson Mandela, and this is essential to the purpose of the Mandela effect, as I intend to show, the real life story has to be a life story that's based on facts. So the question to ask here is not which version is true, the glowing majority report or the brutal condemning minority report. The question to ask is, which version is fact-based? Fact-based. So that if you want to go and search for the facts, you can find the facts and come up with a narrative supported by the facts, and then you know the truth. And may your attention be rewarded by the truth if you choose to do so. Just want to remind you that I proposed early on an outrageous notion early on in these talks, in this sequence of talks. I proposed that the Mandela effect will show you that you are living in a divine experiment. Well, I'll put it to you straight, folks. You have to be qualified to take on that knowledge. And in order to know that you are living in a divine experiment and how it works and how it was designed and who designed it and where it's going, and also to know what's gone wrong with it, you need to base your judgments and assessments and your overall orientation to that divine experiment on the facts. So you can see how relevant now, perhaps you can see how relevant it is to have a PsyQ test at the onset of the investigation of the Mandela effect. And I'd like to bring up another point to you, moving as rapidly as I can, because I'm trying to adopt my teaching technique to the format of YouTube and keep this under 22 minutes, and I might get down to even less. I'd like to put this before you. It's granted that there are so many psyops and mind control lying narratives on the planet that no single individual can get to the facts behind all of them. So if you know the facts behind the Kennedy assassination, behind the anthropic global warming scandal, behind 9/11, behind the Federal Reserve Bank, if you know those facts, then you have gotten to the bottom of the deck, and you have found the truth based on facts regarding those particular instances of psyop and mind control. No single individual can do that with every single case. Well, suppose there is one case that we could all do it on. One case that we could all break together, like a group of detectives, a collective team of detectives around the world, all breaking one single case of a mind control narrative. And from that case, breaking through into the transcendental meaning of the Mandela effect. This is my proposition. This is where I'd like to take you. And I'd like to repeat again that I don't judge anyone on your entry to the PsyQ exam, but I will ask you this point-blank question. If you don't know the fact-based story of the life of Nelson Mandela, that he was a terrorist responsible for the deaths of many people, that he was captured with enormous amount of mines and hand grenades and munitions in his possession, that he was the leader of a terrorist cell that murdered children and women, that blew up churches, that he refused to say that he was sorry for doing any of that he wrote a document in prison about how to be a good communist, and he stood all his life by the policy and the agenda of communism. If you didn't know that, those are the facts and there are more to be revealed. Is that because you simply weren't able to find out? You simply didn't go into that investigation? You didn't take on that case? Fine, fair enough. Is it because you didn't have the time and the attention to dedicate to finding the facts? Or, listen closely, or is it because you don't care about the facts at all? Or, listen closely again, listen very closely, is it because you're incapable of discerning and evaluating the facts? I advise you to reflect very closely on what I'm telling you now. This first instance of a narrative that happens or seems to come up by chance, associating the life of Nelson Mandela with an extraordinary and baffling paranormal phenomenon, is not by chance. Nelson Mandela is kind of like the Sphinx in the road. You stand before that Sphinx, and the very presence of the Sphinx is an enigma that poses a riddle to you, and you cannot pass further into the true power and purpose of the Mandela effect without passing the Sphinx and solving the riddle of the Sphinx. And in this case, the riddle is, why is it named after this individual and not someone else like Audrey Hepburn it is so named to bring your attention to focus at the onset. Even before we go into the decoding of particular instances of the Mandela effect, which is coming up very fast, even before we undertake that, you stand before this one instance, and it's not by accident that you do. There's a possibility that you didn't have time to investigate the Nelson Mandela narrative. A. There's a possibility that you don't care to investigate any narratives that are fed to you by the media and that are repeated mindlessly by 90% of the people on the earth. You don't care. And there's a third really serious possibility that the human faculty required to gather and assess information could be impaired. There's a warning in the initial case of the Mandela effect. That warning is about the impairment of the probative faculty. And the next talk, number 11, will be dedicated exclusively to what I mean by that. For right now, let me proceed with the 3 other points I intend to make in this particular upload. Point 3. If you consider the Minority Report and look at the facts upon which it is based, and you'll find links to the research material in the tracking page, which is continually being developed and continually being filled out and amplified. If you consider the facts that give you a true and authentic narrative of the life of Nelson Mandela, well, it is a fact that 2 really nasty and unpleasant things come up in your face through that narrative. One of them is the subject, the deeply controversial and divisive and incendiary subject of white genocide. There are people who would say, and they can back up their arguments with documentation and facts and current events, people who would say, in answer to the third part of the PsyQ question, well, how did Nelson Mandela come to be regarded by the world at large? There are people who would say he came to be regarded as the monster who directed South Africa into the condition it is today, which is a hellhole of rape, murder, and corruption on an inconceivable scale, and the genocide of the remaining white South Africans. And that it is so bad, and this is a fact, it is so bad in South Africa, as I speak to you today, in March of 2017, that a great many black South Africans, including the tribal leader of the Zulu nation and other indigenous people, are demanding to have apartheid back. They are demanding the return to a system where their society, their business, and their country is managed as it was managed under the white minority of the past. Which white minority, such as it remains in South Africa, is being brutally and sadistically eliminated at a frightening rate. So the Minority Report brings up these facts. These are not pleasant facts. You may prefer to look away, or you may prefer to deny it and say, as many people do, this whole, quote, white genocide thing is a complete fabrication. It's completely untrue. But if you wanted to look anywhere in the world today for glaring and irrefutable evidence that such a thing as white genocide is happening, you could not find a better case than South Africa. And what is happening there is a result of the life and achievement of Nelson Mandela and the people who handled him. That is a fact. The second ugly factor that comes up through the fact-based narrative of Mandela's life is the C word. The C word, communism. Nelson Mandela was a communist. The ANC is a communist organization. What you see today in South Africa is very similar to what you would have seen in the Soviet Union after the Russian Revolution, so-called. What you see in the failed socialist state of Venezuela, the condition of the people, the deplorable condition of public services, the starvation, the corruption, the pyramidal structure of society. All of this is the mark and the predictable result of communism. And Nelson Mandela was a self-declared communist. Now I ask you to take one deep breath and repeat after me this question as if you were in front of me. I'm talking now as if I am you talking to me. Well, wait a minute, John. Hold on here for a second. Where are you going with this, man? Are you saying that the Mandela effect has something to tell us about communism? Yes, I am saying that. And I can prove it all the way down the line when I decode those clusters of instances of the Mandela effect, which I have selected for this investigation. So I don't ask anyone to believe me on faith. Stick with the investigation if you want to find out, or drop out now if the medicine is too strong for you to handle. Final point I want to make is about name change. Now, what was the original name of Nelson Mandela? Now, if you go on the internet, you can certainly find his African name. I'm not going to look it up, but I'm sure it's there. One of the benefits of the internet is that you can do this kind of research. But the fact is that he's not known by his African name. He's known by an assumed name. And so in the story of Nelson Mandela, in the composite of elements, there is this factor which may seem trivial and incidental, but it's a factor that belongs to what I call the warning. There's an inherent warning in the naming of the Mandela effect. You know, it's kind of, I wouldn't call it ironic, but it's a bizarre twist that the name given to the effect is not the genuine birth name of the person. So, I would say then, I would put it to you, that the naming of the effect in that way brings your attention to this phenomenon of name change. Now, why would anyone change their name? Well, you might change your name if you didn't like the name that your parents gave you, that's valid. If your name was Judd Puckle, or Hortense Filibacher, it's valid. You have a right to choose your own name, a name of your liking. But apart from that reason of changing one's name, what would be another reason? Well, how about this? Changing one's name as an act of disguise, as an act of deceit. Now I ask you, is there any particular group of people around the world who are known massively and widely for changing their names? For instance, Bob Dylan is an American folk hero, a poet and a singer, who just won actually a Nobel Prize for literature. But he changed his name. His name was Robert Zimmerman. Or take the British actor Michael Caine. Everybody knows Michael Caine, but do you know what his born name was? Because he changed his name. And there is a well-known and extensive record of people who change their names for the purpose of deceit or disguise, not simply because they don't like their name, for the purpose of social advantage. Nelson Mandela changed his name Now, if I'm reaching you, and if I'm getting across to you, as I seek to do, then every time you think of the Mandela effect, every time you hear of a new instance of it, and it refers you back to the person for which it is named, you will be reminded that that was not his real name, and that there is a factor of deceit and disguise concerning that individual, which carries into the origin of the Mandela effect. And that being so, you are alerted and warned. Yes, there is a warning contained in the Mandela effect. It's about what has gone wrong with the divine experiment on this planet. And I intend to look very closely at that warning and what we may all learn from it in the next talk and in future talks in this series, Mandela Effect Decoded. Thank you for your patience and determination. I will get it down to 22 minutes, and may your attention be rewarded by the